I found out my husband was leaving me because he asked which pieces of furniture I planned to keep. That was how 38 years of marriage ended for me. Not with shouting. Not with tears. Not even with a slammed door. Just a quiet question on a Tuesday afternoon while sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. We had refinished together almost 20 years earlier. My name is Evelyn Harper. I was 66 years old when my husband, Richard, looked across our kitchen island and told me he was leaving. He folded his hands carefully before speaking, as if he were discussing taxes or a doctor's appointment. Claire and I have decided to build a future together, he said. Claire. A woman 27 years younger than me. A woman I had never met. A woman whose name seemed far too small to carry the weight of everything that followed. I remember staring at the bowl of lemons on the counter. Bright yellow. Fresh from the grocery store that morning. I had planned to make lemon bars for our granddaughter's birthday. Strange what the mind notices when life changes forever. I didn't plan for this to happen, Richard continued. But I deserved to be happy. I nodded slowly. Not because I agreed. Not because I understood. But because after nearly 4 decades of marriage, I suddenly realized there was nothing left to argue about. If someone has already packed their heart and carried it elsewhere, no conversation can bring it back. He spoke for another 15 minutes. About fresh starts. About new opportunities. About how life was short. His words floated through the room like distant radio static. I heard them, but they no longer belonged to me. When he finally finished, he looked relieved. As though he had completed a difficult task. As though honesty itself deserved applause. I stood, carried my coffee mug to the sink, rinsed it, and placed it carefully in the dishwasher. That's all? He asked. What else would there be? I replied. His expression changed. Maybe he expected anger. Maybe tears. Maybe some dramatic scene that would help him feel justified. Instead, I simply smiled. Not because I felt strong. Not because I felt brave. But because I was too surprised to do anything else. 2 days later, he loaded boxes into the back of an SUV. The neighbors pretended not to watch. The spring air smelled like freshly cut grass. Richard waved once before getting into the driver's seat. Then he drove away. Just like that. 38 years compressed into a disappearing taillight. That evening, I walked through the house alone. The silence felt unfamiliar. Every room carried evidence of a life we had built together. Family photographs. Vacation souvenirs. Scratches on walls from moving furniture. A pencil mark on a doorway where we had measured our daughter's height year after year. The house seemed larger than it had that morning. Or perhaps I simply felt smaller. Friends called. My daughter called. Even my attorney called. Everyone seemed to assume the same thing. That I would sell the house. Downsize. Start over somewhere easier. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere safer. I thanked them for their concern. Then I made no promises. Late that night, I found myself standing outside a room at the end of the upstairs hallway. A room nobody had used in years. The door remained closed most of the time. Storage boxes filled one corner. Old furniture filled another. Dust covered nearly every surface. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Moonlight spilled through a narrow window. The room looked forgotten. Neglected. Waiting. I stood there for a long time. Then I noticed something strange. For the first time since Richard left, I wasn't thinking about him. I was thinking about possibilities. About paint colors. About light. About change. About what this room could become. The next morning before breakfast, before checking my phone, before speaking to anyone, I grabbed a notepad from the kitchen drawer and began making a list. By noon I had called 3 contractors. By sunset, I had filled 6 trash bags with things I no longer needed. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something stirring beneath the grief. Not revenge. Not regret. Something quieter. Something stronger. Hope. Standing in that forgotten room, surrounded by dust and old memories, I made a decision. If Richard wanted a new life, he was welcome to chase one. But this house, and the woman living inside it, were about to become something entirely different. The contractors arrived the following Monday. 3 trucks pulled into the driveway just after 8 in the morning. I stood at the front window with a cup of coffee and watched them unload ladders, tool bags, and measuring equipment. For a moment, I wondered if I had lost my mind. Most women my age were simplifying their lives. They were downsizing, moving closer to family, or settling into quiet routines. Meanwhile, I was preparing to turn my house into a construction zone. The foreman, a friendly man named Michael, spent nearly an hour walking through the property with me. He asked questions nobody had asked in years. What did I want? How did I want the rooms to feel? Which spaces made me happy? Which spaces felt wrong? First, I struggled to answer. For decades, nearly every decision had been made as part of a partnership. Even small choices carried the invisible question of whether Richard would like them. Standing there in the dusty upstairs room, I realized I had not asked myself what I wanted in a very long time. Michael waited patiently while I studied the faded walls. Finally, I pointed toward the window. More light, I said. Then I pointed toward the ceiling. And less of this. He smiled and wrote everything down. The work began 2 days later. The first sound was surprisingly satisfying. Not loud, not dramatic, just the steady rhythm of progress. Old shelves came down. Worn carpeting disappeared. Boxes that had not been opened in 15 years were carried outside. Dust floated through beams of sunlight like tiny pieces of history finally letting go. Every evening after the workers left, I walked through the room alone. I studied each change carefully. Sometimes I carried a folding chair inside and simply sat there for a while. The empty space felt different every day. Larger, brighter, more hopeful. My daughter Karen visited during the second week. She stood in the doorway and stared at the exposed framing. "Mom," she said, "this is a much bigger project than I expected." "I know. Are you sure about all of this?" I looked around the room. "No," I said honestly, "but I am sure I am not finished living." She became quiet after that. Then she wrapped her arms around me and rested her head on my shoulder. It was the first time either of us had mentioned the divorce since Richard left. We did not need to discuss him. The unfinished room said everything that needed saying. A few days later, I discovered something unexpected while sorting through old storage containers. Hidden beneath stacks of holiday decorations was a cardboard box covered in dust. I almost threw it away without opening it. Instead, I carried it downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. Inside were sketchbooks. Dozens of them. My sketchbooks. I had completely forgotten they existed. Before marriage, before children, before careers and responsibilities, I loved drawing. I used to spend entire weekends filling page after page with house designs, room layouts, and architectural details. I turned each page slowly. Some of the drawings were nearly 40 years old. The handwriting belonged to a younger version of myself, a version that seemed both familiar and distant. One sketch stopped me cold. It showed a bright reading room with large windows, built-in bookshelves, and a comfortable chair positioned near natural light. I stared at it for several minutes. Then I laughed softly. The room I had drawn at 24 looked remarkably similar to the renovation I was building at 66. That evening, I taped the sketch onto the refrigerator. Not because it was perfect, not because anyone else would see it, but because it reminded me of something important. Long before I was somebody's wife, I had been my own person. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten her. Now, surrounded by fresh plans, scattered tools, and the sound of change echoing through the house, I was beginning to find her again. By the third week, the house no longer sounded like a place holding its breath. Every morning began with movement. Trucks arrived. Doors opened and closed. Voices drifted through the halls. The steady rhythm of progress replaced the silence that had settled over everything after Richard left. I found myself waking up earlier than usual, making coffee, and sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook. At first, I filled the pages with renovation ideas, paint samples, lighting plans, furniture layouts. Then gradually, the lists became more personal. Places I wanted to visit, books I wanted to read, classes I had always postponed. The notebook became evidence that my future still existed. One afternoon, while the workers installed new windows upstairs, I drove to a small bookstore downtown. It was a place I had passed hundreds of times but rarely entered. Richard never cared much for bookstores. He preferred golf courses and business lunches. For years, I followed routines that fit neatly alongside his. Standing among the shelves that afternoon, I realized how many of my own interests had quietly faded into the background. I bought 3 books, a sketch pad, and a set of colored pencils. The cashier smiled and asked if I was an artist. The question caught me off guard. I almost said no. Instead, I paused. I used to be, I replied. That evening, I sat in the partially renovated room with my sketch pad balanced on my knee. The walls were unfinished. The floor still needed work. Electrical wires peeked from behind exposed sections of drywall. Yet somehow it already felt beautiful. I began sketching the room as I hoped it would look when everything was finished. Large shelves, comfortable chairs, warm lighting, a place designed entirely around peace rather than obligation. A few days later, Karen stopped by unexpectedly. She carried takeout containers from my favorite Italian restaurant. We ate dinner surrounded by paint samples and construction plans. At one point she looked around the room and laughed softly. "You know," she said, "I have not seen you this excited in years." I wanted to disagree. I wanted to insist that I had been happy before. But the truth settled quietly between us. Happiness and fulfillment were not always the same thing. I had spent years maintaining a life. Now I was building one. Later that night, after Karen left, my phone buzzed with a social media notification. I rarely paid attention to those. Curiosity got the better of me. The photo showed Richard standing beside Claire at a rooftop restaurant somewhere in the city. Both of them smiled at the camera. Expensive drinks sat on the table. The caption spoke about new beginnings and exciting adventures. For a moment I studied the image. Months earlier, it would have ruined my evening. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Distance. Not bitterness. Not anger. Just distance. Their lives were moving in one direction. Mine was moving in another. I set the phone down and returned to my sketchbook. Outside, the sun was setting. Golden light streamed through the newly installed windows and stretched across the floorboards. The room glowed. I looked around slowly. The transformation was still incomplete. Dust remained in corners. Supplies were stacked against walls. Nothing was finished yet. Then again, neither was I. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt less like a problem and more like a promise. The renovation entered a new phase as summer settled over the neighborhood. What had once looked like a construction project now began to resemble a home with purpose. Fresh paint covered walls that had carried decades of memories. New light fixtures replaced outdated ones. The built-in bookshelves I had dreamed about since finding my old sketches finally took shape. Every morning brought another visible change. Every evening gave me another reason to believe I had made the right decision. One Saturday, Michael handed me a small box he had discovered while removing part of an old cabinet. "Thought this might belong to you," he said. Inside were several photographs tucked beneath a stack of yellowed papers. I sat at the kitchen table and looked through them one by one. There was Karen at 8 years old holding a science fair ribbon. There was our family standing in front of the Grand Canyon during a summer vacation. There was Richard and me painting the living room shortly after we bought the house. We looked young, tired, hopeful. For a moment I felt a familiar ache. Not because I wanted my old life back, but because I finally understood something I had spent months trying to avoid. The marriage had not ended the day Richard left. It had been fading quietly for years. We simply had not noticed it while moving through our routines. I placed the photographs into a new album instead of hiding them away again. They were part of my story. They did not need to disappear simply because the ending had changed. A few weeks later, Karen convinced me to attend a community art class at the local cultural center. I resisted at first. The idea felt uncomfortable. Most of the people there would probably know each other. I imagined myself sitting awkwardly in a corner wondering why I had come. Karen ignored every excuse I offered. On Thursday evening, I found myself walking into a bright classroom carrying my sketch pad. To my surprise, nobody seemed interested in judging anyone else. Some students were retirees. Others were young professionals. One man admitted he had never drawn anything beyond stick figures. By the end of the evening, I was laughing with complete strangers. Driving home, I realized I had spent 3 hours without thinking about my divorce. That realization felt significant. Not because I was forgetting Richard, but because my life was finally becoming larger than the loss. Around the same time, I heard bits and pieces of news through mutual friends. Richard and Claire had moved into a luxury condominium downtown. They traveled frequently. They attended social events. Their lives appeared polished and exciting from the outside. Yet every update sounded strangely repetitive, as though the same story was being told with different scenery. I listened politely when people mentioned them. Then I changed the subject. My attention belonged elsewhere now. One evening after returning from art class, I unlocked the front door and stopped in the entryway. The house felt different. Not because of the renovations. Not because of the furniture or the paint colors. The difference was harder to explain. The rooms no longer felt like reminders of what had been lost. They felt like invitations to what might come next. I walked upstairs to the reading room and switched on the lights. Warm golden light filled the space. Books lined the shelves. A comfortable chair sat beside the window exactly where I had imagined it months earlier. I lowered myself into the chair and looked around quietly. Then I smiled. The room I had once drawn as a young woman was finally real. And somehow so was I. Autumn arrived quietly that year. The maple trees lining my street shifted from green to shades of gold and amber, and every morning I carried my coffee upstairs to the reading room before the day fully began. The renovation was finished now. The workers were gone. The dust had settled. For the first time in months there was nothing left to fix. At least not inside the house. One Tuesday morning, I received an email from the Community Art Center. They were organizing a local exhibition featuring work from students and instructors. One of my sketches had been selected. I read the message 3 times before I believed it. The drawing was simple. It showed a sunlit room with bookshelves, a large window, and a comfortable chair positioned beneath natural light. The same room I had imagined decades earlier. The same room that now existed at the end of my hallway. I almost declined the invitation. Old habits are difficult to break. For years, I had convinced myself that certain opportunities belonged to other people. More talented people. More confident people. Younger people. Yet something inside me had changed over the past several months. Instead of finding reasons to say no, I found myself saying yes. The exhibition took place on a cool Friday evening. Karen attended with me. As we walked through the gallery, I felt nervous in a way I had not experienced since my 20s. People stopped to study the artwork. Conversations drifted through the room. Glasses clinked softly. Then a woman approached me and pointed toward my sketch. "Is that yours?" she asked. When I nodded, she smiled warmly. "There is something peaceful about it. It feels like hope." I thanked her, but her words stayed with me for the rest of the evening. Hope. Months earlier, I would have described my life using very different words. Loss. Disappointment. Uncertainty. Now a stranger had looked at something I created and seen hope. On the drive home, Karen reached across the center console and squeezed my hand. "Dad never understood this side of you," she said quietly. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "I do not think I understood it either," I admitted. A few weeks later, another unexpected opportunity arrived. The director of the art center called and asked whether I would consider teaching a beginner sketching workshop once a month. My first instinct was to laugh. Me? Teach? But the more I thought about it, the more the idea appealed to me. Not because I considered myself an expert. Because I understood what it felt like to lose part of yourself and spend years trying to find it again. The first class filled quickly. 12 students sat around folding tables on a rainy Thursday evening. Some were retirees. Others were younger adults searching for a creative outlet. As I walked between the tables offering encouragement, I realized something remarkable. I was not thinking about what had happened to me. I was thinking about what was happening now. When class ended, I remained behind to clean up supplies. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. The room smelled faintly of paper and pencil shavings. I paused for a moment and looked around. This life was not the one I had planned. It was not the future I imagined during 38 years of marriage. Yet standing there in that quiet classroom, I understood something that would have been impossible for me to accept months earlier. Sometimes the end of one story creates space for a better one to begin. And for the first time, I no longer felt as though I was rebuilding after a loss. I felt as though I was finally building something that belonged entirely to me. Winter arrived earlier than expected that year. A light snowfall dusted the neighborhood in early December, turning rooftops white and covering lawns with a quiet blanket of frost. From the large window in my reading room, I watched the first flakes drift through the air while holding a mug of tea. The house felt warm, comfortable, lived in. Not because of the renovation anymore, but because it finally reflected the person living inside it. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and strangely familiar. I taught my monthly sketching classes. I attended community events. I spent afternoons reading beside the window I had dreamed about for decades. Some days were busy. Others were wonderfully ordinary. For the first time in years, I no longer measured my happiness against someone else's expectations. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected conversation changed something. I was leaving the grocery store when I ran into an old family friend named Susan. We had known each other for years, though we had not spoken recently. After exchanging greetings, she hesitated for a moment. "I hope you do not mind me saying this," she began carefully, "but you look wonderful." I laughed softly. "That is kind of you." She shook her head. "No, I mean it. There is something different about you." Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways. Later that evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied my reflection. The silver hair was still there. The laugh lines around my eyes had not disappeared. I was still 66 years old. Yet Susan had been right. Something was different. The exhaustion I carried after the divorce was gone. The uncertainty had faded. In its place was a quiet confidence I had never expected to find at this stage of life. A week before Christmas, Karen came over for dinner. We ate homemade soup at the kitchen table, while holiday music played softly in the background. At one point, she looked up from her bowl and smiled. "You know, Dad called me last week." I paused briefly. "How is he?" She shrugged. "Fine, I guess." The answer felt incomplete, but I did not press for details. After a moment, she continued. "He asked about the house." I stirred my soup quietly. "And?" "He wanted to know how the renovation turned out." I smiled. "He could always ask me." Karen smiled back. "I think he already knows that." The conversation moved on, but her words lingered. Not because I was curious about Richard. 'Cause I realized I was not. There had been a time when every piece of information about him felt important. Now it felt distant. Like hearing news about someone I once knew a long time ago. A few days later, I received a holiday card from a former student in my sketching class. Inside was a handwritten note, thanking me for encouraging her to start creating again after retirement. I read the note twice. Then I placed it carefully on the mantel above the fireplace. The room was decorated for Christmas. Soft lights glowed from the tree. Candles flickered nearby. Snow drifted gently outside. Standing there, surrounded by small reminders of a life I had built piece by piece, I understood something important. The greatest change had never been the new walls, the new windows, or the redesigned rooms. The real transformation happened slowly, almost invisibly, one decision at a time. Every time I chose growth over fear. Every time I chose possibility over regret. Every time I chose myself. And somewhere beyond the glow of holiday lights and falling snow, a chapter one once thought would define the rest of my life had quietly become part of my past. Spring arrived with clear skies and longer afternoons. The snow disappeared, flowers returned to front gardens throughout the neighborhood, and people seemed eager to spend more time outdoors. One Saturday morning, I was watering the flower beds near my front porch when a car slowed to a stop along the curb. A woman stepped out and introduced herself as a reporter for a local lifestyle magazine. First, I assumed she had the wrong address. Then she explained that someone from the community art center had shown her photographs of my reading room and shared a little of my story. She asked whether I would be willing to do a short interview about creativity, reinvention, and finding purpose later in life. I almost declined. The idea of discussing my personal journey with strangers felt uncomfortable. Yet after thinking about it for a few days, I agreed. The interview lasted less than an hour. We talked about art, the renovation, and the importance of continuing to grow no matter your age. I never spoke negatively about Richard. I never described myself as a victim. I simply told the truth. Sometimes life changes unexpectedly. Sometimes those changes create opportunities we never would have discovered otherwise. Several weeks later, the article was published. I expected very little to come from it. Instead, something surprising happened. People began reaching out. Women from neighboring towns sent letters and emails. Some were recently retired. Others had experienced major life transitions of their own. Many simply wanted to say that the story gave them hope. I read every message carefully. One evening, after finishing my sketching class, I sat alone in the reading room with a stack of letters beside me. Each one represented someone searching for possibility in a season of life often overlooked by others. The responsibility felt humbling. A month later, the magazine invited me to participate in a local home and lifestyle event. Several renovated homes would be featured, including mine. Visitors would walk through the property and learn about the design process. The idea sounded intimidating, but Karen encouraged me to accept. On the morning of the event, dozens of people moved through the house. They admired the bookshelves, the natural light, and the thoughtful details incorporated throughout the renovation. Yet what seemed to interest them most was not the design. It was the story behind it. Again and again, people paused in the reading room and asked similar questions. What inspired the transformation? How did I find the courage to begin? What advice would I give someone starting over? I answered as honestly as I could. There was no secret formula, no magical turning point. Change happened one small decision at a time. One room, one sketch, one class, one day. By late afternoon, I felt exhausted but grateful. As the final visitors left, I stood near the front window and looked out across the yard. The house had become something I never expected. Not a monument to the past. Not a reminder of loss. It had become proof that growth remains possible at any age. A few days after the event, Karen called with excitement in her voice. "Mom," she said, "people are talking about you everywhere." I laughed. "That sounds dangerous." "No," she replied warmly. "It sounds deserved." After we ended the call, I walked upstairs to the reading room and settled into my favorite chair. Sunlight streamed through the large windows. The shelves were filled with books. My sketch pad rested on a nearby table. The room felt peaceful, familiar, alive. As I sat there quietly, I realized that the life I once feared was over had actually led me somewhere I never planned to go. And for the first time, I could honestly say I was excited to see what came next. The knock came on a quiet Thursday afternoon in late September. I was arranging books on a shelf in the reading room when I heard it. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 measured knocks at the front door. I glanced at the clock. A little after 3. I was not expecting anyone. Setting the book aside, I walked downstairs and crossed the foyer. Through the decorative glass beside the door, I could see the outline of a man standing on the porch. For a brief moment, I did not recognize him. Then I opened the door and saw Richard. Time has a way of changing people. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough that one day you notice the difference. He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders seemed slightly lower. The confidence he once carried so easily appeared muted. He offered a small smile. "Hello, Evelyn." I stepped back and opened the door wider. "Hello, Richard." Neither of us moved for a second. Then I invited him inside. Felt like the polite thing to do. He entered slowly, looking around the foyer. His eyes traveled across the walls, the lighting, the furniture. Everything was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. "The house looks incredible," he said quietly. "Thank you." We settled into chairs in the living room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different from the silence we used to share during the final years of our marriage. This one carried no tension, no expectation. Just 2 people acknowledging the distance that now existed between them. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "I have seen some of the articles." I nodded. "A few people sent them to me. You have accomplished a lot." "So have you," I replied. He smiled faintly, though the expression did not fully reach his eyes. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. The house felt calm, steady, grounded. Richard looked around again before speaking. I almost did not. "Come. Why did you?" The question hung between us. He studied his hands for a moment before answering. "Because I realized there were things I never said." I listened quietly. There was no anger left in me. No desire to argue. Whatever conversation was about to happen belonged to the present, not the past. "When I left," he said carefully, "I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. Everything seemed so clear. I convinced myself that starting over would solve problems I could not even explain. He paused. But life is not always as simple as we imagine. I nodded without commenting. He was not asking for validation. He was simply speaking his truth. I made mistakes, he continued. More than I understood at the time. His voice softened. And I never expected you to do all this. He gestured toward the house. I never expected you to become this version of yourself. The words might have sounded insulting months earlier. Instead, they felt strangely honest. The truth was that I had not expected it either. Richard looked toward the large front windows. You seem happy. I smiled. I am. Another silence settled between us. Comfortable this time. Almost peaceful. Finally, he looked back at me. There was regret in his expression. Not dramatic regret. Not the kind people describe in movies. Something quieter. More human. I made a mistake, he said. The sentence landed softly. I did not rush to respond. I simply looked around the room we once shared. Then I looked at the man sitting across from me. For the first time in a very long while, I felt no need to change the outcome of the moment. Whatever happened next, my life no longer depended on it. After Richard spoke those words, neither of us said anything for a while. The afternoon sunlight continued its slow journey across the living room floor, and somewhere outside, a lawn-mower hummed in the distance. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. The kind that once passed unnoticed. Now they felt important. Richard sat quietly waiting. Perhaps he expected a response. Perhaps he expected forgiveness. Or perhaps he simply wanted to be heard. I stood from my chair and smiled gently. Come with me, I said. He looked surprised but followed as I led him through the house. We started in the kitchen. Bright. Open. Full of light. Nothing like the dark, crowded space it used to be. Richard glanced around carefully. I barely recognize it. That is the point, I replied. We moved from room to room. The living room. The guest room. The hallway lined with photographs and artwork. Each space carried traces of change. Not dramatic change. Intentional change. Thoughtful change. The kind that happens when someone stops asking what everyone else wants and finally begins asking what they need. Eventually, we reached the reading room at the end of the upstairs hallway. The room where everything began. Sunlight streamed through the large windows. Books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling. A comfortable chair sat beside a small table holding my sketchpad and reading glasses. Richard stepped inside slowly. This used to be a storage room. I know. He nodded quietly. I remember. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I walked toward the window and looked outside. The trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The garden below was thriving. Everything felt peaceful. Do you know what is funny? I asked. Richard looked at me. What? I smiled softly. When you left, I thought this house was what needed saving. He remained silent. I thought if I repaired enough walls and replaced enough old things, I would somehow feel whole again. I rested a hand on the back of the chair. But that is not what happened. Richard lowered his eyes. No. No, I looked around the room. The house was never the real project. Understanding slowly crossed his face. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Like sunlight filling a room. It was you, he said quietly. I nodded. It was me. The words settled between us. Simple. Honest. True. Months earlier, I might have felt satisfaction seeing his regret. Now I felt something else. Compassion. Not because he deserved or did not deserve it. Because carrying resentment no longer served any purpose. We stood together for another moment before heading downstairs. At the front door, Richard paused. He looked around one final time. I am glad you found this version of yourself. I smiled. So am I. He nodded slowly. Then he stepped outside. There was no dramatic farewell. No attempt to rewrite the past. No promises about the future. Just acceptance. He walked toward his car, climbed inside, and drove away. This time I watched without sadness. After he disappeared down the street, I closed the door and stood quietly in the foyer. The house felt warm, steady, alive. I walked upstairs to the reading room and settled into my favorite chair beside the window. A book rested on the table. My sketchpad lay nearby. Sunlight filled the room exactly as I had imagined all those years ago when I first drew it on a sheet of paper. I looked around slowly and smiled. Life had not unfolded according to my plans. It had taken unexpected turns. It had brought loss, uncertainty, and change. Yet somehow it had also brought me here. To a home that reflected who I was. To a life built on my own choices. To a future that still felt full of possibility. And as I sat there surrounded by light, I understood something that took 66 years to learn. The most important relationship I would ever build was the one I had finally rebuilt with myself.